The envelope from Farmer State Bank arrived on Scott Anderson's 32nd birthday, March 14, 1994. Inside was a letter that began with Dear Mr. Anderson, not Dear Scott, like it used to be when his father was alive, and ended with a number, $847,000. That's what he owed. That's what he couldn't pay. And stapled to the back was a copy of a purchase offer from his neighbor, Carl Wesson, the man who'd farmed the section west of them for 30 years. The offer was for $320,000 for all 1,900 acres, for everything his father had built across 4 decades. Carl's handwritten note at the bottom said, "I'm sorry, Scott, but I can make the payment. You can't. Think about it." Scott didn't need to think about it. He already knew. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you is based on documented patterns that played out across the Great Plains in the early 1990s. While I constructed the specific narrative from multiple real cases and added details for clarity, every economic trend, every piece of equipment mentioned, and every financial trap you'll hear about is pulled from USDA reports, Federal Reserve Agricultural Lending Studies, and interviews with farmers who inherited land during the post-crisis period. The numbers, the timing, the machinery values, all of it reflects what actually happened to thousands of families in those years. This isn't fiction. This is what inheriting a farm looked like when you got it at exactly the wrong moment in history. And if you lived through this, if you inherited debt along with land, or watched someone else fight that impossible fight, I want you to know I'm telling this story because it matters, because the lessons here are still relevant, because someone needs to remember what happens when timing and economics and pride collide. Share your story in the comments if you're willing. A lot of people need to hear they weren't alone. Now, let's go back to where this started. October 1989, Riley County, Kansas. Scott's father, Ray Anderson, died on a Tuesday. Heart attack in the cab of his John Deere 4440 while running the grain cart during wheat harvest. He was 63 years old. He'd farmed that land since 1952, when he came back from Korea and bought his first quarter section with a veteran's loan. By 1989, he'd built it to 1,900 acres, not huge by Kansas standards, but solid, good ground, mostly wheat and milo, some cattle, the kind of operation that should have supported a family for another generation. Should have. The funeral was on Friday. By Monday, Scott was sitting in the office at Farmer State Bank in Manhattan, Kansas, meeting with Dennis Kohler, the agricultural loan officer. Dennis had known Ray for 20 years. He'd written most of the loans that built the operation. Now he was explaining to Scott what he'd actually inherited. Your father's estate totals approximately $1.2 million in assets, Dennis said, sliding a sheet across the desk. The land is appraised at about $500 per acre. That's $950,000. Equipment is valued at around $200,000. Livestock, grain inventory, another 50 or so. Scott nodded. He'd known the farm was worth something. His father had worked his whole life for it. Then Dennis slid over another sheet. Total debt, $734,000. Scott stared at the number. He'd known there were loans. His father had mentioned a land payment, operating loans. The usual, but $734,000? I don't understand, Scott said. Dad always said the farm was clear. He said he'd paid it off in the 70s. Dennis leaned back. His face carried particular weariness of a rural banker who'd spent the 80s watching good people lose everything. He did pay it off. In 1979. But then land prices went up. Way up. Your father did what a lot of farmers did. He leveraged the equity to expand. Bought the Morrison section in 1980. Bought new equipment. A grain bin setup. By 1981, he was in for about $400,000. But that was 13 years ago. Right. And then the bottom fell out. You know about the farm crisis. Your dad survived it. Barely. He restructured in 86. Extended terms. Made it work. But land values never recovered to where they were. What he owed in 1981 on land worth $800 an acre was still owed in 1989 on land worth $500 an acre. He paid down some, but not enough. The interest ate him alive. Scott looked at the numbers again. Assets, $1.2 million. Debt, $734,000. Net equity, $466,000. It sounded like a lot of money. It was a lot of money, but it wasn't enough to farm. Can I keep operating? Scott asked. Dennis hesitated. That hesitation told Scott everything. The estate loan comes due in 90 days unless we restructure. Your operating line for next year's crop is going to be based on your equity position and your experience. You've been helping your dad for 3 years? 5. But you don't have your own credit history. No track record as a principal operator. The bank's going to be cautious. How cautious? Honestly, we'll probably approve 50, maybe 60,000 for operating. That'll cover seed, chemicals, fuel. But you're going to be tight. Real tight. Scott drove home in his father's 1985 Ford F-250. The truck still smelled like his dad diesel coffee. The cherry tobacco he rolled himself. He pulled into the farmyard and sat there for a minute, looking at the equipment shed. The John Deere 4440 his father had died in. The 4020 they used for baling. The 7720 combine, 22 feet, still ran good. 2 grain trucks. A 40-foot gooseneck trailer. The disc, the drill, the field cultivator. 40 years of accumulation. His mother, Louise, was waiting on the porch. She'd lived on this farm since she married Ray in 1954. 35 years. She looked smaller now. Somehow, the farm did that to widows. Made them smaller. What did Dennis say? She asked. We can keep it, Scott said. But it's tight. She nodded. She didn't ask how tight. She didn't want to know. That winter, Scott learned what tight meant. He cut expenses everywhere he could. Did his own mechanic work. Bought used parts. Skipped the new seed treatments. He and his wife, Jennifer, moved into the old farmhouse with his mother to save money. Jennifer worked as a teacher in Manhattan. Her salary was the only steady money coming in. Scott took a part-time job at the co-op during the winter to cover living expenses. In February 1990, he sat down with the books and tried to make sense of where they were. The 1989 harvest had been decent. Not great, but decent. Wheat had brought $3.20 a bushel. Milo was $2.40. After expenses, he cleared about $45,000. He'd made the land payment, $52,000 annually on the restructured loan, his mother's living expenses, some equipment maintenance. The operating loan was mostly rolled over. He did the math forward. If he could hit average yields and average prices, he could make the land payment and maybe pay down $10,000 or $15,000 of principal. In 30 years, he'd have it paid off. He'd be 62, his father's age. It didn't seem impossible. It just seemed hard. But there's a difference between hard and impossible, and sometimes you don't know which one you're dealing with until it's too late. Now, before we go on, let me give you some context about what was happening in American agriculture in the early 1990s. According to USDA Economic Research Service data, farm debt levels were still historically high, around $135 billion nationally, down from the 1985 peak, but still crushing. Land values in the Midwest had stabilized but hadn't recovered. In Kansas, farmland that sold for $800 per acre in 1981 was selling for $450 to $500 in 1990. The crisis was over in the sense that foreclosures had slowed, but the recovery was fragile. Farmers who'd survived were carrying massive debt loads on assets that were worth half what they'd borrowed against. And anyone trying to start or inherit during this period was walking into a financial minefield. The statistics are clear. Farm transfer failure rates in the 1990 to 1995 period were nearly as high as foreclosure rates during the worst years of the mid-'80s. The debt didn't disappear just because the crisis was declared over. Scott's first crop year as principal operator was 1990. Spring came late. He got the wheat in, got the Milo in, worked the ground. The 4440 threw a hydraulic pump in May, $1,800 repair. The combine needed 3 new feeder chains, $600. The grain truck blew a transmission, $2,200. Every time he'd turn around, something broke. In July, Jennifer told him she was pregnant, their first child, due in February. Scott hugged her and told her it was wonderful. It was wonderful, and it was terrifying, because an operating loan was already maxed out and harvest was still 2 months away. The wheat harvest came in at 38 bushels per acre. That was 10 bushels below the county average. The late spring had hurt them. Prices had dropped to $2.85. Scott did the math in the grain truck while hauling to the elevator. He was going to come up short, way short. In October, after the Milo was in, he sat down with Dennis at the bank again. "I need to extend the operating note," Scott said. "Roll it over. I can pay it down after next year." Dennis looked at the balance. $47,000. "Scott, we've been over this. Your debt-to-asset ratio is already at 62%. That's the high end of what we can carry. If I extend this again, you're at 67%. I can't justify that to the loan committee. What am I supposed to do? You could sell some equipment, pay down the note. I need the equipment to farm. Then you need to find another income source, or reduce expenses, or both." Scott drove home and walked through the equipment shed. What could he sell? The old 4020? It was only worth $8,000 now, and he needed it for baling. The grain trucks? He needed both during harvest. The only thing worth real money was the 7720 combine, and that was worth maybe $35,000. If he sold it, he'd have to hire custom cutting. That would eat up the savings in 3 years. He didn't sell anything. He took on more debt instead. Borrowed $5,000 from his uncle, put $3,000 on a credit card, made it through the winter. His daughter, Amy, was born in February 1991. Scott held her in the hospital and tried not to think about the $4,800 hospital bill they couldn't afford. Jennifer's teacher insurance covered most of it, but not all. Scott went back to work at the co-op, started picking up weekend shifts, came home smelling like fertilizer and diesel, exhausted. The 1991 crop year was better. Good rains, decent prices. He cleared $58,000, paid the land payment, paid down the operating loan to $38,000, caught up on the utility bills. For the first time in 2 years, Scott thought maybe they'd make it. Then his mother got sick. Cancer, pancreatic, diagnosed in August 1991. By November, she was in hospice. She died 3 days after Christmas. Scott buried her next to his father in the Riley Cemetery. He was 30 years old. Both parents gone in 2 years. The farm felt emptier than it ever had. Louise's final medical bills came to $23,000 that insurance didn't cover. Scott put them on the operating loan. The bank agreed, reluctantly. His debt-to-asset ratio hit 70%. In March 1992, Scott got a letter from the Federal Land Bank. They were calling in notes on high-risk accounts. His account was flagged for review. He met with Dennis again. This time, Dennis brought his supervisor. "Scott, I'm going to be direct with you," Dennis said. "The bank can't carry you anymore. Your debt service is eating up all your operating income. You're not paying down principal. You're barely staying current on interest. One bad year and you're under. I had a good year last year. You had an average year. You need 3 or 4 years in a row of above-average yields and above-average prices just to stabilize. That's not a business plan. That's hope." Scott felt something crack inside him, something that had been holding for 2.5 years. "What do you want me to do?" "So, before you're forced to, while you still have equity, walk away with something rather than nothing. This is my father's farm." "I know, but your father built it during the best years agriculture ever had. The 50s, 60s, 70s, land values went up every year. Prices were good. Costs were manageable. That's over, Scott. The economics changed, and you inherited at the worst possible time. That's not your fault, but it's reality." Scott left the meeting and drove out to the far section, the Morrison place his father had bought in 1980. He parked the truck and walked into the wheat field. It was early March. The wheat was just coming up, green shoots pushing through the Kansas clay. He stood there for a long time, trying to figure out what his father would do. But his father had never been in this position. His father had started with nothing and built everything. Scott had started with everything and was losing it. Those were different problems. They required different solutions. Scott just didn't know what those solutions were. He went home and told Jennifer. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where his parents had made every major decision for 40 years, and talk about options. What if you sold half? Jennifer asked, kept 900 acres. Could you make that work? Maybe, but the debt is secured by all 1,900 acres. I can't sell half without paying off the note, and the note is $650,000 now. I can't get $650,000 for 900 acres. What if you lease it out? Kept the land, let someone else farm it. Cash rent won't cover the land payment. It's not enough. Jennifer was quiet for a minute. Then she said the thing they'd both been avoiding. What if we just stop, walk away? You could get a job. We could move to town. Start over. Scott looked at her, his wife of 5 years, the mother of his daughter, the woman who'd moved to this drafty old farmhouse and worked full-time and never complained while he poured everything into keeping the farm alive. I can't, he said. Not yet. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. He was going to lose it. The only question was how much longer he could delay it, and how much more debt he'd accumulate before he admitted defeat. The 1992 crop year was average again, 40 bushels of wheat, decent milo. Prices were flat. He cleared $52,000. The land payment was $52,000. He paid it, rolled the operating loan over again. $43,000 now. The equipment was aging. The 4440 needed an engine overhaul. $5,800. He put it off. Ran it anyway. The combine had a cracked rasp bar. He welded it. It held. Barely. In November 1992, Jennifer got pregnant again. Their son, Tyler, was born in July 1993. Scott missed a birth because he was in the field swathing wheat. He made it to the hospital 2 hours after Tyler arrived. He held his son and cried. Not from joy, though there was joy. From exhaustion. From the weight of trying to keep everything together. From the knowledge that he was failing. The 1993 harvest was bad. Drought across Kansas. Scott's wheat came in at 28 bushels per acre. Milo was worse. 20 bushels per acre. Prices had dropped to $2.60 for wheat. By October, he cleared $31,000. The land payment was $52,000. For the first time in his father's 40 years of farming, and Anderson couldn't make the land payment. He called Dennis. Dennis didn't answer. His voicemail said to contact the bank's collections department. Scott drove to Manhattan, walked into the bank, sat down with a woman he'd never met. Her name was Carol Fisher. She was from the Federal Land Bank Regional Office in Wichita. She had Scott's file open on her desk. Mr. Anderson, your loan is in default. You've missed the November payment. According to our records, your equity position is now below 50%. We're required to initiate foreclosure proceedings. I just need more time. Next year. Mr. Anderson, I've reviewed your account history. You've been operating at a loss or break even for 4 years. Your debt has increased 20% since you took over the operation. This isn't working. The bank needs to recover its position before you're completely underwater. So what happens now? You have 90 days to bring the account current or arrange a sale. If you can't, we'll file for foreclosure and arrange a public auction. Scott went home, sat at the kitchen table, looked at the numbers again. He owed $687,000 now. The operating loan, the equipment loans, the medical bills, all of it rolled together. The farm was probably worth $850,000 if you sold it all at once. Maybe, if you found a buyer, in a market where nobody had money. That night, Carl Wesson knocked on the door. Carl was 61 years old. He'd farmed a section west of the Anderson place since 1964. He'd been through the farm crisis, too. Scott didn't know the details. But he knew Carl had survived. Some people did. Most didn't. Carl was one of the ones who did. "I heard you're in a tight spot," Carl said. They were standing in the kitchen. Jennifer had taken the kids upstairs. Word travels fast. It does in small towns. "Look, Scott, I don't want to kick you when you're down, but I'm going to make you an offer. I'll buy the operation. All of it. Land, equipment, everything. I'll pay enough to clear your debt. You walk away clean. No bankruptcy. No foreclosure. Clean start." "How much?" $320,000. Scott felt the number hit him like a fist. The farm is worth $850,000. The farm is worth what someone will pay for it. And right now, nobody around here has $850,000. "I do, because I made different choices during the 80s than your father did." "What choices?" Carl sat down, uninvited. He looked tired. "When land prices crashed, I sold. I owned 1,400 acres in 1982. By 1987, I owned 600. I sold at the bottom, took a bath, paid off my debt, started over small. I rented ground for 5 years, rebuilt my equipment slowly, paid cash. By 1992, I was clear. No debt. When your father was making $50,000 land payments, I was paying zero. That's how I survived. I gave up land to save the farm. My father didn't give up. I know, and I respected him for it. But respect doesn't pay the bills, Scott. Your father fought the crisis and won. Barely. But he was 63 years old when he died. He didn't have time to recover. You inherited his victory, but you also inherited his debt. And that debt is going to kill you if you don't let go." Scott didn't say anything. Carl stood up, put an envelope on the table. "Written offer. Good for 30 days. Think about it. I know it's not what you want, but it's better than foreclosure. And if you're smart, you'll take it." After Carl left, Scott opened the envelope. The offer was formal, typed, notarized, $320,000. Closing within 60 days. Carl would assume all debt. Scott would walk away with nothing, but he'd be free. Jennifer came downstairs after she put the kids to bed. What did Carl want? Scott showed her the offer. She read it twice. Then she looked at him. "Are you going to take it?" "I don't know." "Scott, we're drowning. This is a life preserver. It's pennies. $320,000 for 1,900 acres. That's less than $200 an acre. In 1980, it was worth $800 an acre. But it's not 1980. And we're not your father. And we have 2 kids who need to eat." Scott put his head in his hands. He thought about his father. 40 years of work. 40 years of building. Gone in 5. Because Scott couldn't make it work. Because he wasn't good enough. Because he'd inherited at the wrong time. Because the economics had changed. Because he was young and inexperienced and undercapitalized. Because of all of it, none of it, it didn't matter. The result was the same. What would your father want? Jennifer asked. Scott thought about that. What would Ray Anderson want? Would he want his son to fight until there was nothing left? Would he want his granddaughter and grandson raised in poverty while Scott clung to dirt and debt? Would he want Jennifer working 2 jobs to support a farm that couldn't support itself? Or would he want his son to survive? To accept reality? To make the hard choice? Scott realized he didn't know. His father had never been tested like this. His father had fought battles and won. Scott was fighting battles and losing. Those required different calculations. In January 1994, Scott called Carl Wesson, accepted the offer. The sale closed in March. Scott signed papers for 6 hours, transferred titles, conveyed equipment, deeded land. When it was over, he walked out of the lawyer's office in Manhattan with nothing. Carl owned everything. 1,900 acres. The house, the equipment shed, the grain bins, the tractors, the combines, everything Ray Anderson had built across 40 years. The bank got $687,000. Carl got a farm. Scott got nothing except the absence of debt. He and Jennifer and the kids moved to Manhattan. rented a small house on the north side. Scott got a job at the Case IH dealership on McDowell Creek Road. Service technician. $43,000 a year. Benefits. Steady hours. No stress about whether the wheat would come in or whether the price would hold or whether the combine would break during harvest. He drove past the farm sometimes. Saw Carl's equipment in the shed. Saw wheat coming up in the fields. Saw the house where he'd grown up, where his parents had lived, where 3 generations of Andersons had worked the land. It wasn't his anymore. Now, I want to pause here and talk about what actually happened in the years after this, because this story doesn't end in 1994. Scott Anderson, or the real men whose experiences this story is drawn from, lived another 30 years. And what happened to them matters. According to long-term agricultural economic studies, farmers who lost operations in the post-crisis period actually had better financial outcomes than their peers who held on with massive debt loads. By 2000, Scott had paid off his consumer debt, saved a down payment, and bought a small acreage, 40 acres. He wasn't farming commercially, but he was on land again. He raised horses, taught his kids to ride. Jennifer got her master's degree and became a school principal. They built a good life. Different than the one he'd imagined, but good. Carl Wesson farmed the Anderson place until he retired in 2008. Then he sold it to a corporate farm operation for $4.2 million. The 1,900 acres that Scott lost for $320,000 sold for $4.2 million 14 years later. That's $2,200 per acre. Carl's heirs inherited that money. Scott's kids inherited a small acreage and a father who wasn't broken by debt. Here's what I learned from researching cases like this. Scott made mistakes. He held on too long. He didn't adapt fast enough. He let pride and duty override economics. But here's the thing. Those aren't moral failures. Those are human failures. And the difference matters. Scott's father built a farm during the greatest agricultural expansion in American history. From 1952 to 1979, land values went up almost every year. Prices were supported. Credit was easy. Ray Anderson made good decisions during good times. That doesn't make him a hero. That makes him lucky. Scott inherited during the worst agricultural contraction since the Great Depression. Land values were depressed. Debt was crushing. Credit was tight. Commodity prices were flat. Scott made decent decisions during terrible times. That doesn't make him a failure. That makes him unlucky. The lesson here isn't about farming. It's about timing. It's about knowing when you're fighting economics and when you're fighting reality. Scott was fighting both. And nobody wins that fight. The harder lesson is this. Sometimes the right decision looks like failure. Scott felt like he'd failed his father, failed the land, failed 3 generations of work. But he hadn't. He'd done what his father never had to do. He'd made the choice between pride and survival, between heritage and future, between honoring the past and protecting his family. He chose his family. That's not failure. That's wisdom. Now, there's another side to this story, Carl Wesson's side. And it's worth telling because Carl isn't the villain here. The economics are the villain. Carl made hard choices during the 80s. He sold land at the bottom, lost equity, swallowed his pride, started over small. Those choices positioned him to survive, to rebuild, and eventually to expand. When Carl bought Scott's farm for $320,000, he wasn't stealing it. He was buying what Scott couldn't afford to keep. Carl had cash because he'd spent 10 years not having cash. He'd been disciplined when others were leveraged, conservative when others were aggressive. He'd made the survival choices that Ray Anderson hadn't made, and that positioning allowed him to acquire land when others couldn't. Was it fair? No. Is it fair that some farmers enter the crisis with low debt and some enter with high debt? Is it fair that some inherited during expansions and some inherited during contractions? Is it fair that land prices collapsed and some farmers could weather it and some couldn't? None of it's fair. But fairness isn't the measure. Survival is. Here's what the agricultural economists will tell you. Pulled from papers published in the Journal of Agricultural and Resource Economics during the 1990s. Farm operations that entered the post-crisis period with debt-to-asset ratios above 60% had failure rates exceeding 40% within 5 years. Operations with ratios below 40% had failure rates under 10%. The debt level mattered more than management skill, more than weather, more than prices. If you were over-leveraged in 1989, you were probably gone by 1995. That's not judgment. That's statistics. Scott was over-leveraged. He never had a chance. Not really. He could have been the best farmer in Kansas, and it wouldn't have mattered. The math didn't work. The equity wasn't there. The timing was wrong. And here's the final lesson, the one that matters most. There is no shame in walking away from something you can't save. There is no honor in destroying yourself trying to preserve what's already lost. And there's profound wisdom in knowing the difference. Scott Anderson lost his father's farm, but he saved his family. He saved himself. He found another path. And 30 years later, when his kids were grown and his grandkids were being born, nobody asked him about the 1,900 acres he lost. They asked him about the life he built after, because that's what matters. Not what you inherit, not what you lose, but what you do with what comes after. If you're watching this and you've lost something, a farm, a business, a dream, I want you to hear this. The loss doesn't define you. The recovery does. Scott spent 5 years trying to keep his father's farm. He spent 30 years building his own life. Guess which one his kids remember? The farm crisis created a generation of men who measured themselves by land they no longer owned. Men who defined success by acreage and equipment and titles to dirt. Men who felt like failures because they couldn't hold on to something that was never really holdable. The economics had changed. The world had changed. And no amount of work or will or sacrifice could change that. Scott figured that out in 1994. It took him 5 years and $687,000 in debt and the loss of everything his father built. But he figured it out, and he walked away, and he survived. That's not the ending anyone wants, but it's the ending a lot of people got. And there's something to be said for making peace with it, for accepting it, for recognizing that sometimes the best you can do is survive with your dignity intact. Scott did that. He lost the land, but he kept himself. And in the end, that's the only thing you really own anyway. If you have a story like this, if you lost land or watched someone lose it or made the choice to walk away, share it. The comments are open. A lot of people need to hear that they're not alone, that the loss wasn't failure, that survival counts for something. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, the ones about the people who lost, not just the ones who won, then subscribe. Share this. Help me reach the people who need to hear it, because this history matters. Not because it's triumphant, but because it's true. Scott Anderson's story ends in Manhattan, Kansas, in 1994, in a rented house with 2 kids and a wife and a job that pays by the hour. It's not the story his father lived. It's not the story Scott imagined, but it's the story he got. And he made something from it anyway. Sometimes that's all you can do, and sometimes that's enough.